Well, Steve Case, it is an honor to have you back. You're one of the very few who's been here before, and Glutton for Punishment returned to this sort of Wayne's World, Face the Nation, weird hybrid we've got. We appreciate your spending time with us on what I know is a really busy book tour. So welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be back with you, Bruce. I always enjoy these talks. I try to attend as many of them as I can. And it's nice to give me an opportunity to talk about the book and what's happening more broadly around entrepreneurship all across the country.
Well, I appreciate that. So we love the book. Normally, as you recall, I will hold up the book for everybody to see, but you've totally outclassed me on that regard.
You can still hold it up. That's okay. You know, more the merrier.
For everybody who's attending, we will, after this, we will send a link to all of you to enter your mailing address, and we bought copies of the book for anybody who wants one. But I love the book. It was super fun. It affirmed all that you talk about, but the biggest sentiment I had was I wish I was on the tour. It sounds like it was really, really, really fun. You know, sort of it sounds like a really fun tour. But the thing I wondered about is it replicable? Because sort of like American Idol or Shark Tank, I mean, you guys, when you roll into town, it's the biggest thing going on. Everybody comes to you. And so I would imagine the harder piece of being a VC looking for deals in smaller cities is finding them, but you've solved for that because they all come and hunt you down. And I was just interested in as you think about the replicability of finding deals like you can find.
Well, I think when we first got started with our first bus tour, which was 8 years ago, that might have been the case. But what's happened since is we now have 200 investments in 100 different cities. And 20% of those came from being on the bus tours. Most of that came from building the network all across the country with now hundreds of regional venture capital investors that we co-invest with. So it started as a tour, but it's turned into a much more kind of a platform investment strategy. But I should, a little bit the backstory for those who are unaware of this. I got into this about a decade ago, kind of by accident, to be honest. I was not something I was particularly, looking to pursue. And it's kind of ties in particularly with the, kind of this DC centric audience. I was asked to co-chair something called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship as part of the Commerce Department. That led to a series of recommendations, one of which led to President Obama launching an effort at the White House called Startup America Partnership, which he asked me to chair. And then I was asked to be on his Jobs and Competitiveness Council and led the effort around entrepreneurship, which helped pave the way for the Jobs Act that passed 10 years ago, Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act. So that's how I kind of got into this. And that opened my eyes to two things that, frankly, I was not aware of. One was that most of the new jobs in the country are created by new companies, not by small business or big business, but new business companies less than 5 years. And that was important, particularly at the time a decade ago, because the unemployment rate, as people will remember, was near 10%. So people were focused on creating jobs. That led to focus more on new companies, which led to a focus on startups. And the second thing that was kind of a news to me, particularly the degree of it, was that 75% of venture capital, investment capital to launch these companies, was being invested in just 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the other 47 states were being disadvantaged. The entrepreneurs in those states were being disadvantaged. Often that led them to leave where they were to go to the coast because that's kind of where the money was. So that kind of got us going. And then we launched our first bus tour in Detroit and Pittsburgh and other cities 8 years ago. We did 8 of these bus tours, now 44 cities. But beyond that, as I said, we've invested in 100 cities. And I just was reflecting at the early stage of the pandemic that I've had this opportunity to be on the road, to see firsthand what was happening in these different cities, meet hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs. And I found the whole story striking and surprising and really quite optimistic about the future of some of these cities and also the future of our country, which led me to write the book. So that's a long answer to a short question, but hopefully that provides a little context in terms of how we got to now.
No, that's great. And I appreciate it too, because I dove right into one of the deeper dive questions, but you're right. I've read the book, but a lot of folks maybe didn't sign up to get it instantly delivered to them. So I appreciate it. And actually, maybe going to the book first and then some of the more thematic questions. And I would note your optimism, just every page is just overwhelming with optimism. It really, for those of us who any given day read the news and kind of feel depressed about the state of the country or the future of the world or the nation, this is a good antidote to that. Within that, just as I thought about, there was all these awesome stories. What's been the best investment of all the folks so far that you guys have invested in?
Well, it's early because most of these are early stage seed investments and the early round to get started. Most companies take somewhere between 5 and 10 years to really get to kind of scale. One that was one of the early investments we made in Detroit, one of the first cities I mentioned we visited, a company called StockX. We were in the first seed round, and it was just an idea. It's sort of a stock exchange for things. And initially it was focused on sneakers. Now it's expanded in other areas. It now has a multi-billion-dollar valuation. Actually recently hired the executive vice president of the New York Stock Exchange to become the CEO of this company. It scaled nicely, and I don't remember exactly what the return is. Probably 100x return for us on that. So that was one that we did early, and we've been able to monetize most of that stake that's done well. But there are many others that are doing well. We have 7 or 8 that are unicorns, which in the investment world means billion-dollar plus valuations. And when you're investing at that early seed round, that obviously is great to see.
And I would note again for future readers here on the call, there's so many cool stories. I remember that one thinking, man, what a great idea. What of the people you've invested in, which would you, and I know they're all awesome in various ways, but what do you think is the most ingenious business where you're like, wow, that is, that's brilliant?
Well, I hate this question because this is really like asking parents who their favorite child is. We have 200 children we backed here, and we of course love them all, and we're cheering them all on. In terms of most ingenious, that's kind of an interesting word. I would say one that launched here in DC, actually, Class Technologies during the pandemic, a serial entrepreneur with experience in the education sector, watching his own kids struggling to learn online, started this company, which basically is simplified and professionalized some of the technology running on top of Zoom, and that's been licensed by a lot of schools. I think that was an interesting example of somebody seeing a problem and deciding to start a company to do something about it. There's one in Atlanta that I thought was pretty ingenious, which is a company called Hermeus that's developing Mach 5 engines and jets. So you get from Atlanta to Europe in 90 minutes. Actually, the Air Force is a big customer of theirs already, because obviously the Air Force wants to move things quickly. I thought that was both interesting, and also the fact that it was in Atlanta was interesting because that's become sort of an aerospace hub. Georgia Tech is one of the great research universities, and it has an expertise in that sector. So I thought that was pretty ingenious. Also, there's a woman that we met in suburban Indianapolis, Megan Glover, who 5-6 years ago was concerned about her kids' drinking water. The Flint, Michigan crisis around water safety was in the news. She's wondering if her family was drinking water that was unsafe. So she called the water utility saying, I want to get my water tested. And they said, wait, we actually don't do that for consumers. So she called some other company and said, we'll do that, but it'll cost you several $1,000s. So this is crazy. And started a company to make it affordable for consumers to test their water. Now actually sells that to cities, including San Francisco. So those are a few of the examples. As I said, I could give you 200 other examples of really interesting ideas that entrepreneurs saw. The core entrepreneurs sort of see a problem, and instead of just complaining about it, they do something about it. They start a company and to address that problem and turn that problem into an opportunity. And I think the key message of this book is that's happening in a lot of parts of the country. And most people don't know about it. And hopefully this book will help change that narrative.
Yeah, actually, the one about the water testing, I put a yellow sticky in on that page. I actually want to see if it's makes any sense at the individual home level. It may be a little more industrial at the moment, but it feels like
initially was just for home, just for consumers, but then she expanded it to create an offering for cities. So definitely you can give that a try.
My wife will be really happy when I come back and get paranoid. So Steve, let me ask on the macro picture, of course, is that people have over concentrated their investments in and their mindset in believing that tech-based economic development is only possible on the coasts and in a couple of the huge cities. And it's, again, you prove it with like 200 examples. So clearly you're right. But I also, I was thinking back to some of the Michael Porter cluster stuff, and clusters are clusters for a reason. There is a concentration, and it's often around universities. And it means that, that not only am I able to find alternative talent because people can jump from company to company, so it's easier to quickly staff up a new idea, but also it's, they're mentors, and there's a reason that clusters have developed, Northern Virginia or biotech in Boston, and I don't see you as per se disproving that as much as perhaps suggesting one of two things, and I'm interested in which one. Either that may have been true at the very onset of the internet, but that's not so true now, or there are a lot more clusters than people appreciate, but it's a little bit like you only see the brightest stars if there's a lot of other light around, and if you take a little bit of the light off, you realize, wow, there's lots of stars.
Well, it's a multifaceted question, so let me try to unpack it. First of all, venture capital is a relatively recent phenomenon, just a little over half a century ago, and it started in New York, then moved to San Francisco and Boston, and that's where a lot of the venture capital built up. Number two, the early days of the internet, including AOL, starting in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, was fairly regionally distributed, and not just our company, but Dell, the computer company, was in Austin. IBM's PC operations were in Boca Raton, Florida. The big communications modem company, Hayes, was in Atlanta. CompuServe, one of the leading online services, was in Columbus, Ohio. Sprint, the communications company, was in Kansas City. Microsoft actually started in Albuquerque before moving to Seattle. I could give you a couple dozen other examples. So that what I thought of the first wave of the internet was more regionally distributed. It's really only the last 20 years, so the second wave, when it's been about software and apps writing on top of the internet, that Silicon Valley has become so dominant. I think in this next wave, what I call the internet's third wave, when the internet kind of meets the real world, that will advantage these cities that have domain expertise in healthcare, in food, and things like that. So that's critical. And I also would just note that when we did start AOL in 1985 in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, there was no venture capital in the area. We had to go to Boston, New York, Toronto, San Francisco to raise venture capital. There was not a startup community in Northern Virginia or in the DC region. It was pretty much, as you know, kind of a government town. So we've seen that develop, seen DC become more of the greater DC area become more of a startup region. Even the fact that Amazon picked it as its second headquarters site, a few years ago, was inconceivable when we got started, 35 years ago. So that just shows you what's possible, where kind of momentum, begets momentum. And the last point is, I agree with your point around clustering, but I would note that some of the most important research universities and some of the most important research hospitals in areas like healthcare are in different parts of the country. It's just when people have graduated, historically, they've left because there's the opportunity is someplace else, in part, not entirely, but in part because the money's someplace else. Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, for example, one of the great universities around AI and robotics. Most people graduating from CMU 10, 15, 20 years ago left to go to Silicon Valley or some other city. Now more people are staying in Pittsburgh. We're seeing that with Michigan and Ann Arbor, a great city. We're seeing that yesterday I mentioned I was in Phoenix. They have 95,000 people on campus at ASU, another 85,000 that are online. More of those people are staying in Phoenix. One company we backed there with, 2 years ago, had 20 employees. Now they have 200 employees, and they're doing that in Phoenix. So there is some value to bringing people together. There is some value in clustering. There is some value in building around, kind of industry domain expertise. It just doesn't have to mean that you're only going to do that in San Francisco, New York, and Boston. We can do that in several dozen other cities, and that's really, again, I profiled 29 different cities in the book. I could have kept going, but figured at some point you gotta stop. This is the phenomenon of the rise of the rest is not about one or two or three new startup cities. It's really several dozen.
Well, you need to leave room for a sequel too.
There you go. Rise of the Rest Part 2.
So as a Baltimore guy too, I'm hoping that becomes lots of folks turn to it. Given Hopkins and given the hospital system and the money that Mike Bloomberg has put in, it's disappointing that it feels like we've been lapped on the track by Pittsburgh and Cleveland.
Yeah, Baltimore has tremendous potential. You mentioned, Johns Hopkins, also Under Armour being headquartered there. We're seeing some interesting health tech related ventures being spawned there. And another company that I write about in the book, Catalyte, doing some really interesting things with using AI to identify people that have an aptitude for coding, but never knew it. I remember one story about a UPS truck driver that when he was growing up, nobody talked about coding as a career path. So he's driving a truck and he hears about this company, Catalyte, and goes through this, essentially a test they put people through and then use AI to do some analysis and then identify who are the people that have that aptitude and then put them through a training program and place them in a better job. And I think he was making, after being part of Catalyte, 3 times more than he was before. And if it hadn't been for Catalyte using AI to essentially discover what this talent somebody had that they didn't know about, you'd still be driving a truck. And that, again, people think would that company probably in Boston or New York or San Francisco? No, it's in Baltimore. And that really is the story of all these different companies in all these different cities, and why I finally decided I needed to tell their stories. I needed to champion their stories, and more people needed to know what was happening in all these different cities around the country, and maybe focus a little less on Silicon Valley and a little more on the rest of the country.
By the way, at the risk of giving Marissa a heart attack, assuming she's on here, one thought I had is, man, this would be a great like reality TV series where the bus comes in and it's got a little bit of Shark Tank and have you guys considered making this a bigger media? I hate to say circus, but it already gets a lot of great media. But have you thought about trying to make it a a reality TV element?
There's some discussion about trying to figure out ways to elevate this, maybe even a documentary or something, but we decided the best thing to do was a book. And part of it goes back to what I was saying before. In the last decade, we've done this bus tour that gets a lot of the attention, and we were deliberate in picking a bus and having this kind of Americana road trip, theme to it to get, media attention, because we're trying to tell the stories of these cities and these entrepreneurs. We also use that bus to convene people, bring people together, and try to bring people from outside the community to come join us to see what's happening in the community. But that actually is a relatively small part of what we do. In the last decade, we've done 8 of these bus tours. Each was 1 week. So 8 weeks in the last decade, we've been on the road. The rest of the time, we've been building relationships with entrepreneurs and investors and mayors and governors and CEOs and university presidents all across the country to build out this Rise of the Rest network. And that hard work, that kind of the meeting people, where they are and getting to know what they're doing and trying to better understand what might be possible in that particular community is not nearly as interesting to the reality TV world. So I think we'll keep doing our work relatively quietly, and then occasionally surfacing like with this book to try to make sure people know about what's happening.
Well, Marissa, I'm sure appreciates the grinded out doing serious work and not moving on to the Mehlman version celebrity Rise of the Rest. So Steve, let me ask you this. You had your Rise of the Rest theory, which you observed with the Obama Commission. I would argue it's clearly correct. You proved it out. What do you think you learned? Because that you assumed and you observed and you proved and you give tons of examples. So I think you make a compelling case. But what did you not expect that now that you've gone through this and you've written the book, you wouldn't have thought you would have included at the start?
I'd say one thing is the breadth of this. That, as I said before, it's not just a few cities; it's a few dozen cities, and even some of the cities we were headed to, I wasn't quite sure what exactly we would see, and I always came away impressed and surprised, and so in different cities we're doing different things, and so there were different kind of narratives to it. But the overall theme was this is a much broader phenomenon than I would have thought. The other would be, and it goes back to some of the more recent things, obviously related to the pandemic that we talked about, is what's happened the last couple of years in terms of it's kind of a shake the snow globe moment. People are rethinking work and life and how to live and how to work and where to live and where to work and remote work and hybrid work and so forth. that's a really interesting, I think, tipping point in terms of what's happening that likely will accelerate this rise of the rest phenomenon. So those are a couple of things that I got going in. I expected. The other thing that I reflected on when I was writing the book, and I mentioned this in the book, is that for me there's a little deja vu all over again, because when I did co-found AOL with Jim Kimsey and Mark Serif in 1985. And at the time, only 3% of people were online, and they're only online an hour a week. And we said we wanted to get America online. Most people were super skeptical. Most people did not think normal people would ever get online. I remember hearing people say, why do you think people will use email? Do you really think people will sit down at a keyboard and type a message when they could just pick up the phone and call somebody? And people would be skeptical about e-commerce. Do you really think people are going to buy products from somebody they never knew and type in their credit card into some internet thingy that, who knows what's going to happen? Maybe a hacker will steal their credit card. There's a lot of skepticism. And for a decade, the skeptics were right. From the time we started to 10 years later, we grew very slowly, a couple of times almost hit the wall, had to go through some layoffs. And finally, after 10 years, things really accelerated. And I think that's what's likely happening with the rise of the rest. The last 10 years, we've kind of been building the foundation, learning about these cities, making some of these investments. It feels like this is really an acceleration point, really a tipping point. So I do think if people are looking for kind of a silver lining in what's been obviously a tragic pandemic, it may be this. It may be that this rethinking of work and life and more flexibility about people, where you can live and how you work and so forth is likely going to fuel an acceleration of these rising cities, both because some people who had been in places like Silicon Valley have moved to other places. And while many of them start working remotely for companies in Silicon Valley over time, a number of them start looking at opportunities locally, and that fuels things. And also the skill set around growing companies fast. A lot of the companies in these rise of the rest cities would worry about kind of hitting a wall. Investors would worry about hitting a wall, or maybe they can get to a certain scale, but they can't really go from 100 million to a billion or to 5 billion. Now they're able to tap into talent, expertise in terms of this kind of hyper growth, even if those people don't choose to actually move to that city. So I think this is a moment. I think the whole dynamic around rise of rest is going to really accelerate over the next decade. People are going to be surprised.
Boy, you've hit the like 8 different fields of where I'm hoping to in the next 20 minutes go. But let me ask you, when I think of the rise of the rest cities, obviously you make a good case for many of the merits. They're certainly more livable, so it fits a lot of the Richard Florida thinking. But 2 things that I wonder about were serendipity and mentorship. Serendipity that just Zoom is an unbelievably great, efficient platform, and I love using it. But I don't bump into people I wasn't expecting to bump into because I got to schedule it. And if you're in a city with lots and lots of startups, you're bumping into other founders in a way that in a smaller city you may not. So that's 1. 2, mentorship. You probably have direct experience. Is mentorship equally effective these days, virtual, as compared to where you're in a room with somebody and you can kind of read their body language and take them out to a meal and such? Now, I'm interested if you think that's a challenge for rise of the rest cities.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I do agree that there is value to being physically co-located, and I do believe there is something, as you're saying, to clustering people and the serendipity that comes from that. But these cities we're talking about and that I wrote about, these are decent sized cities. There are hundreds of thousands of people, some cases even over a million people. And what happens in these cities, and again, this is going back to your earlier question, something that was a little bit of a surprise to me, there tends to be an innovation neighborhood within the city that the entrepreneurs cluster in a particular place. I write about in Cincinnati, for example, an area called Over the Rhine, now known as OTR. 20 years ago, it was a really dangerous neighborhood, one of the top murder neighborhoods in the country. Now it's actually the hottest part of Cincinnati, the best, most popular restaurants, in part because the entrepreneurs moved in. Well, like 50, 75 years ago in Soho in New York, the artists moved in and kind of reimagined Soho. We're now seeing in almost every one of these cities we visited, entrepreneurs clustering in a particular place for exactly the reason you mentioned. It's nice to be able to connect with others. So this is not just about everybody sitting on Zoom. They are in these cities, and they're clustering together in these cities. And I agree with your point on mentoring, that That is part of the reason why some of the big banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs have required people to be in, because they believe their model of hiring young, smart people who need training is hard, and mentoring. It's hard to do that in a remote world. And so I absolutely agree that there's value there. My only point as it relates to the rise of the rest is people having more flexibility to live wherever they want and wherever they want to raise their family, while still being able to pursue a good career, either being part of a startup in one of these rise of the rest cities, or maybe launching their own startup in one of those rising cities, or working remotely for some other company. That was not really possible for most people even 3 years ago. And I think it really is a game changer that can accelerate the rise of the rest.
Yeah, I find that compelling and convincing on the acceleration of the use of virtual tools, and the ability therefore to have national and global teams more easily. The other big change that it feels like we're going through right now is the economy is changing pretty substantially. I mean, arguably since the late 90s, we were in an era of easy money, where the big global trends, China, India workers coming online, fracking, containerization, were all pretty disinflationary. And so the Fed's rates were super low, and it was pretty easy to find money. And it feels like that is not the trend for the next decade. If we're in a higher interest rate world, and this is super complicated, I don't understand the answer, but I'm interested if you do, because you're a lot smarter than I am. Do you think that will advantage the rise of the rest cities vis-a-vis the superstar cities, or do you think in an era where it's more expensive to borrow and labor is more expensive, that makes it a harder environment for the ROTR guys?
I would say the changes in the market don't surprise me. First of all, we had a 13-year bull market, and a year ago, 18 months ago, valuations, particularly the later stage private valuation, a year or 2, 3 years before companies were going public, were excessive. They were frothy. We actually, with our later stage fund, Revolution Growth, we pulled back considerably last year in terms of new investments, because we just thought things were generally overvalued. And so the fact that there's been a reset is not a big surprise. But interestingly, and we've been digging into this in the last few months, the reset has been less in the rise of rest cities than in places like Silicon Valley, because these rise of rest entrepreneurs never really had the benefit of easy access to money. It was harder to raise money. Valuations tend to be a little more moderate, classic kind of supply-demand dynamic. So the reset has hit them less than in some of the places where really significant financings were happening at really significant valuations. That's one thing that's been interesting to see. And the other, which is still early, but if I had to predict what's going to happen just based on kind of living through other cycles, is some of the big companies, the incumbents in some of these big industries, healthcare and so forth, when times get a little tougher and they see a slowdown ahead, and borrowing other things are more expensive, they tend to focus on trimming costs. And you see already some rounds of layoffs. But the other thing they tend to do is kill off some of their internal innovation initiatives that they think might in the long run be something interesting, but are costing them a lot of money today. Those tend to be easy things to cut, not necessarily smart things to cut, but easy things to cut, which actually creates opportunities for entrepreneurs, wherever they might be, to capitalize on some of the emerging opportunities, because the big guys that should have a natural advantage pull back, and that allows new companies to emerge and fill that vacuum. So I think we're starting to see the beginning of that. I would suspect that will accelerate in the next few years.
Yeah, one thing I wondered about as well is, to the extent more of VC land, more VCs appreciate the rise of the rest cities, there may be, even in a world with harder to find capital, more interest and attention in the cities that had been more historically ignored. I'm interested in your perspective. Do you think are more VCs cluing into this? And a corollary to that may be, are the returns just as good? Because I would imagine ultimately most VCs are looking for the highest return.
No, sure. The answer to the first question is, we saw a steady increase over the last decade, pretty much each year, in interest of coastal investors in these rise of the rest cities. But it did absolutely accelerate in the last couple of years, in part because pitch meetings could suddenly be on Zoom. And so if you were an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley and you were pitching to a venture capital investor in Silicon Valley, historically, you had to pitch in person. suddenly they were pitching via Zoom, and the venture capitalists realized if they are pitching via Zoom, doesn't really matter if the entrepreneur is a mile away or 1,000 miles away. And that opened their aperture to companies in other cities, and that has helped some of these rising cities. Also, what started to happen, or there's more acceleration what's happening, that even though it's still a little harder to get that early stage capital if you're in these rise and rest cities, 1,400 new venture firms have started in the last 10 years in the rise and rest cities, outside of San Francisco, outside of New York, outside of Boston, 1,400. So there's far more firms in these cities that are backing those entrepreneurs. And then when those companies scale, and we've had, as I mentioned, a number have already scaled, and they're raising significantly larger rounds, not small $1 million, $2 million seed rounds, but $100 million, $200 million later stage growth rounds. That's when the coastal capital tends to kick in. And we've seen that in a number of different cities. And the last point in terms of the returns, when we set out with this fund, and what was interesting about this versus other funds, including even other funds at Revolution, which typically have institutional investors, institutional LPs, we call them. For the Rise the Rest Seed Fund, we went just to individuals and reached out to some of the most prominent individuals in terms of entrepreneurs and investors and so forth, people like Jeff Bezos and Howard Schultz and Eric Schmidt and Meg Whitman and Sarah Blakely, David Rubenstein, Ray Dalio, some really savvy entrepreneurs and investors, and they are joining us as investors in this fund. And we said when we launched the fund just about 5 years ago, we have to generate top tier returns. That is first and foremost. There are some other impact aspects to this, and we've talked about some of them in terms of job creation in these communities. But we have to generate top tier returns because that's the only way, to your question, we're going to get the big coastal money paying attention to these rise the rest cities. And we are definitely on track to do that. The returns have been surprisingly good, even to some of our investors who might themselves have been a little skeptical when we first started talking about this.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. It's as I was reading about it, it felt like there would have been a slight risk that people would say, well, sure, Bill Gates, Steve Case, these guys can afford to look at some of these other cities, and at least business wise, you make the point of no, they're home runs. People just aren't looking for them. I'm a policy wonk. I'm interested as you went through this, and this may be a little bit of, a decade after President Obama set you to the task, but do you feel like there is a new legislative agenda that Congress or at the local level, policymakers really ought to embrace to make more rise of the rest cities and more people within those cities likely to succeed?
Yeah, I'd break it into two things. At the national level, I think there needs to be more of a focus on trying to create a more inclusive innovation economy. And actually, some things that happened just in the last few months, as you know, including the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. The Chips and Science Act had some funding authorized, $10 billion for regional hubs to invest essentially in these rise and rest cities. And that could be catalytic. Things like a place like Silicon Valley didn't happen by accident. Some of that was government investing in semiconductors, half a century ago. So this could be very, very helpful. And even the President Biden was in Columbus, Ohio, 3 or 4 weeks ago with the CEO of Intel, and when the breaking ground on a semiconductor plant being built there, and the Intel CEO said, "We helped build Silicon Valley. Now we're trying to help build Silicon Heartland." So some of that focus on regional innovation, regional entrepreneurship, I think is helpful. Also, some of the funding in the Inflation Reduction Act related to climate that could fuel an acceleration of investing in some of those sectors, many of which are led. And yesterday, I mentioned again, as in Phoenix, there are a lot of focus on water technologies there because strategically it's important to them, and they all have a lot of expertise in that area. So that's some of the stuff happening at the national level. And just last week, I again co-chairing that National Advisory and Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, actually a former venture capitalist, trying to focus on regional entrepreneurship 20 plus years ago before she became a governor, and now Commerce Secretary, kind of restarted that effort and asked me to co-chair it. We had a meeting just last week here in DC and focused on how to take some of this recent legislation and move it forward around regional hubs, around industries of the future. So that's at the national level. At more of the state level and even the city level, we've seen good progress in the last decade. Too often in the past, governors were focusing economic development on trying to get big companies to move their headquarters or open a factory or open a call center. And there really was too much focus on the existing companies and not enough focus on the new companies. A lot of those places have focused much more in the last few years on startups, recognizing the more sustainable strategy for economic development is not luring big companies, but rather launching new companies, some of which might be the big companies of tomorrow. And so that's been encouraging to see.
Secretary Raimondo is impressive. It's
Very impressive.
I'm glad she's relaunching it, and I'm glad she's bringing you back. So that's terrific. You'd mentioned when you co-founded AOL in '85, and you and your co-founders had a vision for an internet that seemed insane, and is now, totally normal. Is the internet that we're living with and that is so integrated into all of our lives today the one you had in mind in '85?
Oh, it's obviously been broader in terms of the impact than even I expected. I always believed, even in those early days when most people didn't believe and most people were skeptical, and for the reasons I mentioned, that someday the internet would change the world. Someday it'd be this new interactive medium that would allow people to get information and communicate with other people and buy products and learn things and be entertained and so forth. So I always believed that, but the extent to which that has happened has surprised even me. And certainly during the pandemic, it was striking to me that the entire world suddenly was operating on the internet. And just a few decades before, most people didn't know what it was or cared what it was. It was sort of, viewed as sort of a fringy hobbyist kind of thing. So that part's been encouraging. At the same time, anytime there's a new technology, there's some positives that come and also some negatives, some unintended consequences. And one that has been surprising and disappointing to me is some of the things around social media, that we were one of the leaders 30 plus years ago around community chat rooms and instant messaging, things like that. That was always sort of the focus at AOL, connecting people. That's now continued with companies like Facebook and many others. And unfortunately, and again, this has been broadly discussed, even being discussed in Congress. Some of the social media platforms have, instead of giving people more voices and allowing people to have a clearer sense of what other people think, sort of this town square dynamic. Unfortunately, we have become more splintered, and that's not just the internet. Cable television obviously has been a contributor there, and people are living in what's been called their own filter bubbles and reinforcing their views, only listening to people that support their views as opposed to hearing the other side. And I always thought, with even the earliest days of the internet, one of the great things about it would be the ability to have more voices and have people have a better understanding of both sides of issues. So that is one area that's definitely been disappointing.
Go maybe 5 more minutes here, if that's okay with
Sure.
you and with everybody. I got DM'd by both a brilliant question, but also it's from my wife. So I would have
You better ask
taken
it
it.
then.
I would have taken it even if it wasn't a good question, but it's a really good question. When you guys are thinking about investing and you make investments, do you throw in like a requirement that they stay local, that they continue to build the cities where you found them?
We don't, but we do. The people do know that we have a strong bias towards these cities, and almost everybody has stayed in those cities. There's one that is shifted and has a significant presence in another city. Some people have this broader regional strategy. But essentially all, maybe there's a few exceptions, but essentially all the companies we backed are still headquartered in the same place. Although the idea of what is a headquarters, for the reason we mentioned, becomes a little bit more complicated when you do have a potentially more dispersed workforce. But the entrepreneurs we're backing are in these cities for a reason. They believe strategically it makes sense, or maybe they're from their cities and want to raise their families there. They have a commitment to the city. They're not just building their company, they're trying to rebuild their community and create a brighter future, more jobs, economic growth, things like that. So they're as enthusiastic champions of these cities as we are. So virtually everybody that we've backed has stayed in those cities, and many of them are really emerging as sort of these iconic tentpole companies in those cities that inspire others to either start companies or back companies or support companies.
Yeah, it's something that I really took away is part of the reason so many of these entrepreneurs succeed is culture and the enthusiasm for the local community, which often goes back to why they even started a company in the first place, is they wanted to solve local problem with local folks. But you get the sense they're special because they're not purely mercenary. It's, the tie to place is a comparative advantage, particularly as a culture matter.
Yeah, I agree with that. And some of this also is just, I think, reminding ourselves, and it's part of what I started the book with, that the American story is complicated. That 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. It was a startup nation that, as you know, almost failed, almost hit the wall, but somehow we were able to survive and then thrive. And a lot of the reason for that, not the only reason, I certainly will credit the patriots that helped forge the republic, but the entrepreneurs built the economy. And we led the way as a nation in that agricultural revolution, then led the way again in the industrial revolution, then led the way again in the technology digital revolution. That's why it went from this fragile startup nation to the leader of the free world, because we have the leading economy. And so that was that pioneering spirit. It happened all over the country. All these cities that we're talking about played a critical role. Detroit 100 years ago was Silicon Valley when the car was the technology of the day. And 100 years ago, Silicon Valley was fruit orchards. It was an agriculture valley, not a startup valley. So these things change. We need to understand the backstory, how we got to now. And we need to make sure we're leaning into the future, that we can continue to compete. We can continue to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in a world that has globalized, and many countries, including China, but many others, are kind of figured out that part of the secret sauce that's made America America is this innovation entrepreneurship, and are trying to lead in the next kind of industries of the future. I believe the only way we can continue to win is if we're spreading our bets more broadly. We're getting more shots on goal by backing more entrepreneurs in more places, and that's obviously what Rise the Rest is all about.
So you had me at hello. I'm with you 1,000%. Steve, I wonder, you ever think about running for office? Because I mean, you just gave a stump speech that would certainly have me knocking on doors and handing out literature. You've been wildly successful in the business and the venture world, and you're now in a tech-based economic development sort of role. Have you thought about whether at taking a cabinet appointment, or even I hear in 2024, you may not be old enough to run in 2024. There may be a requirement to be 75 or older, but have you ever thought about it?
Well, you're kind. I have thought about it, but I think what is best for me is doing what I'm doing. I think as an investor, and I can have a lot of impact backing a lot of entrepreneurs in a lot of places, creating a lot of jobs in a lot of places, maybe even in a small way, helping to unite a very divided country by closing what I think is a pretty stark opportunity gap where most people in most places do feel kind of left out and left behind. And the prism of leveraging my kind of career as an entrepreneur and now as an investor, I think I can have some impact. And I also recognize that the success I've had, to the extent I've had success around policy around innovation, including things like the Jobs Act, was only possible because I was explicitly staying out of politics. And I think focusing on policy and doing it in a bipartisan way, and focusing particularly on innovation, entrepreneurship, kind of staying in that lane works for me. So I'll continue to focus on that. But I appreciate your kind remarks. If you want to go door to door, you should go door to door to talk about the Rise the Rest and help sell books and get the message out.
Hey, I'm selling books. I'm just going virtual. I'm using new technology. So very last question. What's next? The Rise of the Rest, you're on the book tour, which is great. Hopefully it will make a lot more folks aware of it, instead of, the smaller subset of overlap that I was always in, and tech-based economic development. But for the next 2 years, the book tour is done. Then what?
We're going to keep ramping up. As I mentioned, it's a little deja vu. The first decade at AOL was slow. The second decade, things really accelerated. I think the first decade with Rise Rest, we're kind of building the foundation. This next decade, there's an opportunity for it to really accelerate. And it's not just about what we're doing. Part of what we're doing, and part of the reason I wrote the book, is trying to encourage more people with ideas to start companies wherever they are, and more investors to back companies wherever they are. And so that's why we've built this network with hundreds of other investors in different parts of the country that we co-invest with. So we'll look at anything that continues to level the playing field, create more opportunity for more people, more jobs for more people, and allows everybody who has an idea to really pursue the American dream.
Well, that's awesome. Steve Case, it's a great book. You're a great friend for coming to so many of these, let alone appearing now twice. We'll send out a link to everybody. I really do recommend folks read it. Give it out. Christmas is coming up. Give it out to family and friends. It's great work, and it's a great book. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bruce. Great to be with you. Thanks everybody for tuning in.